Hi guys, it's Katie at Quilt Beginnings and welcome to month 3 of your Bejeweled block of the month. So we left off last month. We have completed all of our blocks for our center medallion and I went ahead and sewed mine together. So that is going to be the first part of month 3, is just assembling all of our blocks. So just pay attention as you're putting them together what fabrics are in your corners. So you want to make sure that your green blocks, that you've got the dark green kind of coming down and going up, and you've got your blue swirls towards the inside, towards that medallion. And it does go blue and then purple for this center medallion. So we do the blues into the purples and back out to the blues, and then vice versa here. So you've got your purple swirls in this bottom left, and your kind of marbled purple up in the top, and then that top corner is going to be the same as this bottom corner. So just kind of pay attention as you're putting them together. You should end up with this nice kind of in and out of the blue and green around the outside edge. So just stitch them together kind of like a 9 patch. So I assemble my rows and then just assemble the rows together by stitching them all together. So after you've got that done, then it's time to go ahead and start cutting our borders. We're going to be putting on 3 borders this month, and yeah, that's about it. So let's get started cutting. All right, so the first thing that we want to do is actually measure our center medallion. So this should end up at 27.5 inches. And there's a lot of play on these seams, so if you need to tug just a tiny bit, kind of within tolerance, if you make it to 27.5 without too much stress on the center, then you are good. But if you find that your center is a little bit shorter, maybe it's closer to 27 inches and you really can't make it up, this border stage is one opportunity that we have to actually add in the extra fabric that we might need, because we really want the end of month 3 to be exactly the dimensions that the pattern calls for, because the rest of our quilt is going to be based on that block size. So again, if you are within 1/8 of an inch or so of 27.5, go ahead and we'll be cutting our borders according to the pattern. But if you are, let's say that you are at 27 and just 27 inches, that yours is a little bit smaller. Well, 27 inches is 1/2 an inch smaller than it needs to be. And so you will be adding 1/4 of an inch to each of the borders for just this inner border as we go to cut it. So just, again, kind of an opportunity that you have to straighten things up and make sure that you are nice and square as we go on. All right, so we are only going to be using 3 fabrics this month. We'll be using fabrics B, D, and E. So go ahead and pull those out and put everything else to the side. And we're going to start with cutting fabric D, because that's going to be our innermost border. So I'm going to set these over. And for these, at least how I have them folded, they are relatively straight. They're pretty good for cutting with the fabric strips. I do have my corner piece cut off that I had put on my color sheet earlier, so we do want to make sure that we don't use that piece. But I'm going to just open this up and pull it over, and I'm just going to do my cleaning cut here. So for each of these borders, they are all less than 40 inches. So we're just going to cut 4 strips and then subcut to exactly the length that we need. I'll scoot my mat over. All right, so fabric D, we're going to be doing 2-inch strips. So I'm going to do my cleaning cut on the edge. And we just need 4 2-inch strips. So line up my ruler. Once we have those, we can roll up the rest of our fabric and put that away for another month. Okay, so we have our 4 fabric D strips, and we need to cut 2 of these to 27.5 inches. Now with long strips and with borders, I very often am going to just cut them in half, essentially. So I'll keep them folded in half because sometimes you need to get to 42 inches or something that is much longer than the mat that you're using. I also like to be able to cut off both of my salvages at the same time. So if you find that your strips are not laying flat in any way, go ahead and give them a press. So I've got this little fold is a little bit wrinkly, so I'm going to give that a press. And then you want to make sure that they are lined up nice and evenly. And I bring the fold right over to my 0 line. And I line up both of my strips. We can lay them right on top of each other. Just kind of make sure that they are laying nicely. So 27.5 divided by 2 is 13 3/4. So we're going to be cutting both of these strips in from the fold to 13 3/4. And then when we open it up, that will be 27.5 inches long. I'm going to find my 13 3/4 mark. And when I cut, I'm getting both of my salvages off at the same time. So now I know these are two 27.5-inch strips, and I can go to my next ones. Now these two need to be at 30.5 inches. So divided by 2, that's 15 1/4. So very similarly, I'm going to just lay them right on top of each other, bring them over to the 0 line, kind of keep track, and we go right to 15 1/4 and trim off all of my salvages. You can always double check, just open it up and sort of make sure that this is 30.5 inches long. Okay, so I always like to pin my borders. So we're going to be stitching the two 27.5-inch ones first. Those are going to go on our sides. And again, the side in this case is with a green up in the top left and a purple up in the top right. And so I'm going to take my 27.5-inch border piece, and now I can rotate it. So I'm pinning to a purple in the top left over to a green in the top right. And when I pin, I have to get some straight pins out. I always want to pin kind of perpendicular to where I'm stitching. And so I will pin the edges first. So I'll pin one end and make sure that that's nice and straight on that right angle. I'll come over and I'll pin the other end. And this is where we can take advantage of some of the flexibility of our seams to really ease in the rest of the fabric. So once I have those two pinned, I usually will do the center. And then again, just sort of ease. It should lay relatively flat, but we can then pin in the center again, and then come to this side and pin in the center of this one. Now, because our borders are very far apart, I usually will pin both of them at the same time, and that way I've got them both ready to go when I go over to stitch at my machine. So again, I'll just pin one end first. Come over to the other end. Pin there. And then my center, again, if you have any fullness in the border, because maybe one end of your medallion's a slightly different length than the other, this is where kind of why we're pinning the ends first, so we can ease in and have our center fall right in the middle. Another couple of pins. Pin in between those and pin in between these. Now I'm going to take this to the machine. I'm going to stitch both borders, both of my side borders at the same time. Well, one after the other, but one after the other. So when I'm stitching on a border, I always start right in the corner. And I never stitch over the pins. It's just not really worth knocking my machine out of time and having to come see the techs and doing all that. So I just try to avoid running over pins. And when we pinned, we sort of already eased in a lot of this fullness, but you just want to be sure that you put a little bit of tension on on each of the layers of fabric, just enough that everything is feeding in nice and evenly. So if there's any kind of fullness, again, you just want to make sure that you sort of ease it in between the pins. And take out each of the pins as we come up to it. And then we'll do that same thing on the other side. All right, so I've got both of my borders stitched on, and I always like to press towards the border because it's a straight piece of fabric, no seams in it. It just presses a little bit more nicely, a little bit flatter. And so I always set my seam first. I go along the entire border, just kind of get it warmed up. And then pressing towards the border, really want to kind of lift up, get over that seam allowance, and make sure that you are pressing it nice and flat. I'll do that on the other side. All right, and we are ready to pin our top and our bottom. So just like before, we're going to take our strip, our 30.5-inch strip, and I always pin my two outsides first, and then the center, and then in between. So gather up your straight pins again. We'll line up each of our edges. Make sure those edges are nice and lined up. I'm going to give it a tug, make sure your center's falling right in the middle there. And then pin in between. We'll do that on both sides and stitch this border on just like the last one, and we'll come back and press it out. Okay, so I went ahead and pressed out my fabric D border and then also cut and put on my fabric E border, which is the next one. So I'm going to show you one more time how to go through the border process for our outer border. It's the exact same for all three. And once again, I am going to go ahead and measure at every stage and just kind of make sure that I'm still on track. And I like to measure through the center because the fabric tends to pull in slightly at the top and the bottom, so the center is going to be kind of the most accurate way to get a measurement. And all the seams like to pull in just slightly, and so I sort of smooth everything out and don't put a lot of tension on it, but just sort of smooth things out so that they're laying nice and flat. And for this round, to get out onto the fabric B border, the center medallion should measure 34 inches. And so I am right at the 34-inch line, and that is exactly where we need to be. So once we've measured, the next step is to pull out the fabric. So this is our fabric B. I kind of pull it off of my bolt, or whatever, my fabric stash. And I am going to go ahead and press because it has been folded up for a little bit. So just kind of get it nice and smooth before we get our strips. And for fabric B, we are going to need 1 3/4 inch strips. So I'm going to pull this over, get my fold lined up nice and even on the mat, and do a cleaning cut to begin. All right, and then I just need 4 1 3/4 inch strips. Once I have my 4 strips, I can fold up the rest of my fabric, put it away for next time. And 2 of my strips, I need to cut down to 34 inches. And so once again, I do like to cut my strips folded in half, just sort of make sure that I have enough space on my cutting mat. And I'm going to stack them on top of each other, nice and neat, bring my fold right over to the edge. And 34 divided by 2 is 17. This is where we get out our calculators. And just make sure you're cutting off your selvage end, not your fold side. So I cut this to 17 inches. When I open them up, they will be 34 inches. And then the next 2, from fabric B, we need them to be 36.5. So divided by 2, that's 18.25. So lay them on top of each other, nice and neat. Line them up right with the line on the mat. Over to 18.25. Trim off the selvage. All right, so then we're going to pin on our sides first. And so we're gonna basically be pinning the side, side, side. So we'll have the horizontal seam on the same edge of the quilt. All right, so once I lay this out, I'm going to take one of my smaller strips. Just make sure you're putting right sides down. Gather some pins. And I always like to pin my sides first, my 2 ends first. Get them nice and even. Give them a tug, just make sure that my center is sort of laying right in the middle. Go ahead and pin the middle. And then as we're getting, this is a little bit of a longer border. So once again, you could put 2. I'm just going to go ahead and put 1 pin in the middle in between these, whatever you're comfortable with. And then on this side, lay it out a little bit and pin right in. Whoops. Make sure that it's laying right along the edge. There we go. And pin in between those 2 pins. All right, so we'll pin both of our sides, sew them on, press them out, and then we'll do the exact same for top and bottom. So it's just 3 rounds of borders, and that's what we're doing this month. All right, so we've got our 3 borders on. Go ahead and measure your quilt one more time through the center. It should be 36.5 inches square. Measure it both directions. Now is your chance. If you need to make any adjustments, add another border, trim it down. We really want it to be about exactly 36.5 inches square. So that way we set ourselves up for success for the next month. So next month we're going to be going back to piecing blocks. Hopefully this month you got really comfortable with cutting your borders to size, getting them on, pinning those nice long seams, a little bit of a break from all the angles and points that we've been doing. But next month we're going to get back into blocks, and that's about it. So carry on. If you've gotten this far, give yourself a pat on the back. You've done a really good job, and I'll see you next month.